Hello, everyone. Welcome to MACSMIN, Mathematics and Computer Science for Materials Innovation. So already the fourth event in our series, and it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Henry Adams, currently at the University of Colorado Boulder, but moving to the University of Florida soon. So Henry will talk about additive energy functions that have predictable landscape topologies. Over to you, Henry.
Thanks so much, Vitaly, and thank you, Matthew, for helping get set up, and thanks to all of the organizers. So yeah, it's a pleasure to speak about additive energy functions, which have predictable landscape topologies. This is joint work with my former student, Brittany Story, and some of my slides are borrowed from her PhD presentation, along with Biswajit Sadhu, who was formerly a postdoc working with Professor Aurora Clark, who has recently moved to the University of Utah. And I'm currently based at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, so actually about an hour north of Boulder. But tomorrow I'm moving to the University of Florida, which is where I'll be starting a new position. All right. Great, so this will be a relatively visual talk. And please interrupt me with any questions as we go. So a few years prior to this additive energy paper, I worked on a paper with this group of co-authors in work funded by the National Science Foundation. And we were looking in this first project at very simple molecules, alkanes, which are in a chain. So here, the blue atoms and the black atoms are the same. They're all carbons. And in this first paper, we just looked at chains of carbon atoms in a linear chain, right? And each carbon has 2 or 3 hydrogens sticking off of it, but I'm not showing you the hydrogens, only the carbons in a chain. Okay. And however, the point of the follow-up paper, which I'll be talking about today, is really to study branched molecules. So what if the molecule has a branching like this? So it's a tree structure, okay? And that's one thing that we've focused on in some detail.
Henry,
what we don't, yeah, please.
Great visualization. Could you repeat, please? The black balls are carbon atoms.
That's right. Yeah, so my chemistry set is just running low on pieces. So there's no difference between blue and black. They're all carbons.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So both the blue and the black are the same in my slides as these dark carbon atoms, and the white carbon or the white atoms in the slides are the hydrogens sticking off.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're studying these organic molecules where things are shaped like a tree. You know, if things form a ring, that's more complicated, and we don't look at that in this current work. Only chains and then trees. Okay, so let me give you some motivation before we get into the details. In chemistry, you have many different degrees of freedom in your molecules, so many different ways the molecule can bend and deform. Okay. And so you can think of parameterizing the space of all possible configurations and then assigning an energy to each configuration. So because you have many different parameters, it's a quite high dimensional space, and it's complicated to understand the energy landscape. So chemists focus a lot on local minima. So what are the stable configurations of the molecule? That's where you're most likely to find the molecule in nature. And they also focus a lot on minimal energy paths. So pretend in front of my mountain, I have one local minimum of energy. And then behind the mountain range, I have another local minimum of energy. How do I transition, from one configuration to that other configuration with low energy? So here, there are maybe 5 paths, A, B, C, D, E, that this molecule might take as it deforms from the local minimum in front of the mountain range to the local minimum in the back. So maybe path B or path E is the lowest energy. But still, the molecule will also traverse path A, path C, and path D sometimes, right? So the statistical frequency with which the molecule takes one path versus another is dependent on the height of that saddle point, largely. But you won't always go the minimum energy path. You'll sometimes end up going a less optimal way. Okay, so pretend this is a bird's eye view of our configuration space for the energy of the molecule. And the black dots are the local minima, and the values are labeled 0, 1, 2. The blue paths are these minimum energy paths that transition you from one local minimum to another. And then the purple labels, those are the height of the index 2 critical points, the mountain ranges. And so you can think of, flooding this energy landscape. Where could your molecule be if the energy is below a certain amount? And, you'll see many of the local minima first, and then you'll have these paths form. And eventually, here, once we reach energy 8, these paths with energy 4 and 5 in some sense become equivalent. Now, this is a two-dimensional view, right? But in reality, the domain of our energy might be 10-dimensional or 100-dimensional. And still you'd like to piece out some information about local minima, paths, etc. One thing chemists have used a lot is, is there a question?
Yes, Henry, I'm wondering if you can tell a bit more about energy computations.
Sure.
So where do you get these energy values? And for this particular simple enough molecule, maybe is it simple enough to write down a formula?
Right. So today we'll be working with very simple molecules where you can write down a formula of the energy. The situation that chemists are in, I'm seeing, I don't think I have that slide, but that's okay. The situation chemists are in is much more difficult, typically. So they have tools to, they can't write down a formula for the entire energy landscape, but if you give them a point in the domain, they can evaluate the energy there. Okay. So they have
an algorithm.
What's that?
By a computer program, probably.
By computer program, yeah. So they, put the molecules in that space and then test what are all the forces acting on it. And so then they have techniques where sort of think of gradient descent. They start with a particular configuration. They go in a couple random directions, test the energy in those directions, compute, and then take other random directions. And they try to find local minima just by starting somewhere, many different initial random seeds, and then following the directions that seem to decrease energy until they get stuck at sort of a fixed point. Now, to find these minimum energy paths, one technique that I know about is called nudged elastic band. And so here we have this local minimum labeled 0. Well, let me look at these two. So we have this local minimum with energy 2 and this local minimum with energy 1. Okay. What they do is they start with an initial random path between those two local minima, and they discretize the path, maybe into 10 different nodes along the way. Okay. And then they allow forces to act on the nodes. The main force is just energy minimization. Okay. But they also have additional forces that don't let the band break apart. So they sort of add these spring forces. Because if all you did was looked at energy minimization, your band would split apart, right? Your band would get broken. Here's the saddle point. Your band would get broken at the saddle point and shrink down. But they keep these spring forces intact, so your band can sway from side to side. But it creates that path structure, maintains that path structure to find maybe this blue path labeled 4, and a different initial random seed might find this blue path labeled 5. Yeah, Vitaly.
Henry, so for your molecule, for that simple example, have I understood correctly that the bonds have fixed lengths?
Yeah, so we'll write down a very simple energy function on these types of molecules in which the bonds will have fixed lengths.
Right, but angles are not fixed between the bonds.
The angles are not fixed. That's right. The angles will be our parameters. So here, let's see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 internal edges. So I'm not counting the external edges, but I have 4 internal edges. And so my parameter space will be a 4-dimensional torus because I have 4 circular degrees of freedom, 1 for each internal edge.
Okay, so for the configuration space is 4-dimensional.
That's right. That's right. Now, in reality, it's higher dimensional because there are carbons or there are hydrogens sticking off here. So if I twist it, it changes the energy a little bit, but sort of by a negligible amount in the approximations we're making. Yeah.
So why did you count? So you count only internal edges, right?
Yeah. That's because, you know, here we have carbon. So this, here, let me make it a little simpler. This will be sort of like the simplest molecule we consider. This internal edge, it's changing the locations of the carbons relative to each other. So that's a big change in energy when I rotate here. Okay. This one at the end, if I just spin it, if I just twist around this bond, all that's moving is the hydrogens relative to everything else. So that's a much smaller energy effect than changing the relative positions of the carbons.
So for this configuration of 4 carbon atoms, we have only 1 degree of freedom.
That's right.
1 degree. That's why you count it on the internal edges.
That's right. Yeah. So this is a the configuration for us. This configuration space for us is a circle, and now it's a 2-dimensional torus because I have 1 circle here and another circle here. It keeps going.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. And please keep coming with the questions. It makes for a much better talk, you know, more fun, but also more informative. Okay, so one thing chemists do is they'll look at the merge tree. And this merge tree, it really only studies properties of this sort of minimal spanning tree. So each local minimum is represented by a leaf vertex in the merge tree. And when things merge up, that's what's being measured. And so this red edge with energy 4, that appears in the merge tree as some merging. But this blue edge of energy 5, that's not represented in the merge tree. The merge tree ignores all of these blue edges, which aren't the lowest energy path, even though the molecule still follows them sometimes. So in this prior paper where we were looking at alkane chains, you know, we wanted to look at the persistent homology. So in the persistent homology, the 0-dimensional persistent homology really measures the same information as the merge tree, but the 1-dimensional persistent homology represents also these other paths that are minimal, you know, there may be local minimum paths of energy, even if they're not global minimum paths of energy. So there's more topological information to be measured. You know, so a 1-dimensional hole arises when you have 2 different minimum energy paths, right? And similarly, a 2-dimensional hole might arise when you have a circle's worth of minimal energy paths. All right. So in the first paper, we looked at butane right here. This was the domain was a circle. So this is the energy function defined on the circle. There's a global minimum of energy, 2 local minimum of energies, 2 local maxima, and a single global maxima. And you can compute its persistent homology. Red is the 0-dimensional persistent homology. So you can see these 3 connected components if you cut around this height. And then blue is 1-dimensional persistent homology. So once the entire circle appears, then you have the homology of the circle. And then pentane, I said the domain was now a circle cross a circle or a torus. So this is a square, but its opposite edges are identified to give you the torus. If you slice right here, you get the energy function for butane. If you slice right here, you get the energy function for butane. That's saying if you fix one angle and then you just vary this other angle, it looks like butane. So that's because we're using this very simple additive energy function. And that's really what we study in these papers. Additive type energy functions where the total energy is just a sum of energies on say different parameters. Here are the different angles. So not every molecule can be well modeled by an additive energy function, but these are the ones we consider. And then hexane, you now have one more internal bond, so one more circular degree of freedom, and so you get the three-dimensional torus. And if you sort of zoom in on these bars, you could see that the final persistent homology recovers the homology of the domain. So the two-dimensional torus has a single zero-dimensional connected component, two one-dimensional holes, and a single two-dimensional holes. And these vary like the binomial coefficients. So here, if you zoom in, you can see it's 1, 3, 3, 1 holes of different dimensions. Okay. So if I look at pentane, which has the torus as its domain, this is what the energy function looks like on the torus. You can look at various sublevel sets, and blue is, a single local min, and then 5 local min, and then 9 local min. And you can see that represented in the number of bars, a single local min, and then 5, and then 9. And then at energy level E, you can see that the first holes form. So we have 4 one-dimensional holes, and you can see that in blue, the one-dimensional holes. Chemists are quite interested in these transition points, when new critical points, new critical configurations appear, and we have some of these labeled. So what's really cool is for this simple molecule, these chains, we can write down a model of the energy function exactly, and we can give you an analytical formula for the persistence barcodes, no matter how long your chain is. Okay, so chains of any length with the simple model of energy, we have a mathematical proof of the persistent homology for that simple model. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to generalize this to allow for branching. Okay. So let me make a molecule that mimics the one I have here. Okay. So I have branching, and I have 2 internal edges again, this one and this one. So the domain is a torus, a circular factor across another circular factor. Here's what the energy function looks like, and then here are the various sublevel sets. Okay. So symmetry has now been broken. This bond is different from this bond. And so, the horizontal circular angle is now different than the vertical circular angle. But nevertheless, the sort of the main machinery from that prior paper, which I'll briefly describe, carries through. And we can still give an analytical description of these persistent homology barcodes in dimension 0, 1, and 2. Okay, so let's go into it. Here's a mathematical description of additive energy functions that we study. So you have simpler parameter spaces, like each xi might be a circle for me, okay? We have one circle, one xi for each internal bond, okay? And then you have an energy function associated to each internal bond. And then we're going to define the energy of the entire molecule as the sum of the energies over each internal bond, which is a big approximation. Okay, you can't necessarily always split your energy function into functions that only depend one at a time on each of the individual component factors, right? Sometimes you might want an x1 and an x2, going into the same function. But this entire function on the torus is modeled as an energy function on this first bond plus another energy function on this second bond. And, so I could represent like that. So I have my carbons are labeled by their degrees. So this is a degree 3 carbon, and this is a degree 2 carbon. Okay. Now for each simpler component, this molecule butane we already studied, we figure out what its energy function is, and it's a function on the circle. Okay. And then you look also at this simpler component, and you figure out what its energy function is. It's a different energy function on the circle.
Henry, have I correctly noticed that the function was really simple in terms of cosines? That's
right. Yeah. So let me say a little bit more about this. So right. All right. So this is the energy function for butane, and it's pretty simple in terms of cosines. It's represented here. These C0, C1, C2, C3 constants are typically experimentally verified by chemists. Okay. Now, when you go to a more complicated molecule like this one, okay, so on butane, we called this V, this function V. When I go to this branching one, what you do is you take a sum over all the paths of length 4 that go through this internal bond. So one path goes from here across, and the other path starts down below and goes across. So more generally, this will be a sum over all the paths of length, paths of length 3 edges or 4 vertices that cross that internal bond. Okay, so each of these is a sum of cosines, something like this. Okay, and they're offset by this angle theta, which is sort of physically relevant.
Is this energy, does it have a name? Is it some approximation or what?
Oh yeah, so this is the OPLS UA energy model. So OPLS, I forget exactly what it stands for. UA means united atom. You only pay attention to bonded interactions. OPLS AA stands for all atoms. You also pay attention to interactions between non-bonded carbons. So this is crucial because our model for this energy ignores this interaction where they hit. So the UA model ignores this interaction. The AA model takes this into account, and the energy actually goes up to infinity when these collide. So it's a very simple model that we're using. Okay, but from these smaller pieces, we get the red curve for this internal bond and the orange curve for this internal bond. And you could see those represented on this 2-dimensional landscape. So if I fix the angle of one internal bond and vary the other, it's like a 1-dimensional energy landscape. And then if I fix the other and vary the first, it's a different slice that gives you a 1-dimensional energy landscape. But together, they're combined in this additive type way to give the entire 2-dimensional energy landscape. So the main tool we use is this persistence Künneth formula, which I'll describe, and we didn't invent. I'll attribute it to 4 different papers. But here's our molecule. Here's the persistence barcode for this first bond on the left. And here's the persistence barcode for the second bond on the right in orange. So for each, we just have filtrations on the circle. And I've labeled the bars, the I's and J's. And then I combine these bars in a product-like fashion. Okay, any 2 bars, I and J, combine to give you bars in the product filtration. And they can sometimes combine in a torsion type way, okay, which sort of bumps up the dimension. So here's the landscapes, the persistence energy barcodes for the individual bonds. And there's a formula for how to combine them to get, to get the barcodes of the entire product. So it's an algebraic Künneth formula. And the paper that I've cited here is Kakar and Perea from 2019. But this formula was also studied by Bubenik and Milicevic in 2021. Carlson and Filipenko have a paper about this persistent Künneth formula in 2020. And Polterovich, Shalukin, and Stoyajevic have a paper about this from 2017. So it's very algebraic, but Kakar and Perea phrase it nicely. They tell you how to take bars from the component barcodes and then combine them together to get a product barcode. Okay. And it's sort of like, because our energy function is so simple, it's this additive energy function. That's what allows the persistent Künneth formula to apply to the sublevel sets of these additive energy functions. Okay. So in this paper, we want to broaden the class of molecules that we consider. So we consider, 6 different types of bonds, depending on the degrees of the carbon on one side of the bond or the other side of the bond. And then we look at the one-dimensional persistent homology of these different building blocks, okay? And each building block is an internal bond, so it's a function on the circle, and we get the persistence barcodes for each of these. So now build a tree-like molecule from these simple building blocks and study this OPLS UA, or United Atom Energy Landscape. And we describe how you use persistent Künneth to take the barcodes from these building blocks and combine them together to get the barcodes for the entire molecule. A larger example that might be more interesting to chemists is these polymer type examples, okay? So you have different building blocks stitched together, and we've represented things here as a persistence diagram. The different colors are the different dimensions of the holes, and the chemists are just interested in the distribution of critical points. So how many critical points of index I do you have? And we count that, the number of critical points of index I here. In color, you can see the exact curve of the critical points of each dimension. So of dimension, green is dimension 2, purple is dimension 3, orange is dimension 4. In black, these are just the Gaussian fits, okay? So, but there seems to be a lot of structure here, right? If you look at the best Gaussian fits, you have this symmetry, you have this distribution that as you increase the energy, you get more and more critical points of higher and higher dimension. So yes, we have an analytical formula for the exact number of critical points for the simple energy model. But it feels like there might be some statistical properties going on here that are of interest to the chemists. And, what would be nice is if for the simple analytical formula, we can verify some of those statistical properties hold. And then you might conjecture, do they hold for more complicated energies as well? Okay, so let me end with some open questions, future work, open questions, and then I'll pass it over to the audience to see if they would like to dig into anything in more detail. But all right, so one thing we want to work on, or could be worked on, is the constituent building blocks that we have here. So let me do an example. Okay, so let's say from this molecule just has a single internal bond right here. I'll stop my screen share. This molecule just has a single internal bond right here. Okay, let's say I add to it. And now I have an extra internal bond that's added. Okay, so this bond we would call this right now, it's a 3-2. I'm not explaining this well. Let me try again. Okay, let me punt on this. Let me give you a different future work. Okay, so first, we've only been looking at parameters that are angles so far, okay? But this additive formulation could take into account, for example, bond lengths, okay? So all of our domains were tori, but you could cross that, take the product with a real parameter space that might encode the bond length. Okay, so what if you had not only a circular factor for each angle, but also a real factor for each bond length? It'd be interesting to study molecules from that perspective. And then another perspective that I'll mention is the cyclic perspective. So once things are forced to loop, the product space structure has very much been broken because these bonds can't now vary independently. There's these constraints that they have to meet back up. So our entire formulation doesn't even give an approximation if you want to study the energy functions on cyclic molecules like this. So this is called cyclooctane. Okay, it has 8 carbons arranged in a ring. If you fix if you fix these angles, not the dihedral angles that I can rotate, and if you fix the bond lengths, it's known that the configuration space is a sphere with a Klein bottle glued inside, okay? So you could try to treat that as one of your parameters. You know, you don't just have angle parameters now, you have a parameter space, which is a sphere with a Klein bottle, okay? So that could be one of your building blocks, but we don't have the tools yet to fully understand even the persistence on the cyclooctane. And then go up to cyclononane, so I have 9 carbons. It's not even known what the domain or the configuration space of this molecule is. I think it should be 3-dimensional instead of 2-dimensional for only 8. But right now we're definitely restricted to paths and to branched trees. We can't handle cycles. All right, I'll stop there and pass it over to the audience to questions. So thanks for your time and attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Henry. That was fun, Henry. Yeah, physically and virtually. And is it okay? Yeah, I'll stop recording.